The Punisher is one of the most controversial and compelling characters in the entirety of the history of Marvel Comics, and his worldview and his methods challenge traditional notions of justice and morality as we as the audience see it. And so, as we've done in previous videos, we're going to go over a series of stories involving the Punisher in Marvel Comics. We'll analyze those stories, and then we'll bring it all together to illustrate this idea that the Punisher kind of has a point. So the first thing that I want to talk about here before we get into the stories themselves is I want to talk about the Punisher's origin for a little bit, because this is really what lays the groundwork for everything, in the sense that Punisher Year 1 in 1994 gave us the beginnings of the Punisher and his war on crime. That Frank Castle was presented in this story as a decorated Marine. He returns home and then witnesses the brutal murder of his wife and children in Central Park. And so this event is the catalyst for his transformation into the Punisher, because he's a man that's fueled by grief and rage. And as a result of that, Frank Castle abandons his identity and then dedicates his life to eradicating crime by any means necessary. But one of the best things this story does is it establishes that Frank Castle's philosophy is rooted in the belief that the justice system is fundamentally flawed and incapable of protecting innocent people, that he sees himself as the last line of defense on a societal level, taking on the roles of judge, jury, and executioner. And this perspective aligns with Thomas Hobbes' view of a state of nature, something we've mentioned before and something that we will talk about again, where Hobbes argued that without an ordered government, life in and of itself is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and that in the absence of a reliable social contract, Frank Castle takes it upon himself to enforce order through sheer force. And so the first story that I want to talk about here is the first arc that comes out of Garth Ennis's Punisher run in the year 2000, titled Welcome Back, Frank. And this reintroduces Frank Castle to us as the reader and the Marvel Comics universe after a lengthy absence. And the story itself takes place in the city of New York, where he wages a one-man war against the Ganucci crime family. Now, the story is this visceral depiction of Frank Castle's uncompromising approach to justice, where he systematically dismantles this criminal organization using surgical, brutal, and lethal force. And so Frank Castle's war on this family is a testament to his belief that extreme circumstances require extreme measures. In his view, the legal system, whether through corruption or limitation, is inadequate for dealing with such deeply entrenched criminal enterprises. And so by eliminating this crime family, Castle aims to metaphorically cut off the head of the serpent and reduce the overall level of crime within the city of New York. But this takes us to John Locke's theory of natural rights, which provides a pretty useful framework for understanding Frank Castle's actions within the context of this story, because John Locke argued that individuals have the right to life, liberty, and property, and that when the government fails to protect these rights, regardless of their reason why, individuals have the right and even the responsibility to take matters into their own hands. And so Frank Castle's brutal tactics against this crime family reflect his belief that he's exercising his natural right to protect himself and others when the state has failed to do so. And by dismantling this crime family, Castle believes that he's preventing future harm and suffering that this family would inevitably cause. And this approach illustrates the Punisher's pragmatic and result-oriented philosophy of justice, which is all grounded in a combination of natural rights and even utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And so this leads us to Punisher Born, released in 2003, again by Garth Ennis, and is actually kind of a precursor to what would become Garth Ennis's Punisher Max run. But unlike the other Punisher stories that we're going to talk about here, this takes us to the early days of Frank Castle and his experiences during the Vietnam War. And it's important within the context of this video because it provides an incredible understanding for the basis of why Frank turned into the Punisher following the death of his family. And so this story portrays Castle as a soldier who thrives in the chaos of war, displaying a willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve his objectives. And in fact, the very seeds of the Punisher are shown in the jungles of Vietnam because of the fact that over the course of his time there, his moral compass began to shift. During his time in Vietnam, Frank Castle was confronted with the harsh realities of combat and the moral ambiguities that came with it. That his experiences in this war zone forge his belief that traditional moral codes are insufficient for dealing with extreme situations. And the chaos and brutality of war teach Frank Castle that sometimes moral clarity can only be achieved through direct and often violent actions. And this is reflected in Soren Kierkegaard's concept of the leap of faith, which I'm probably butchering that name. But Kierkegaard argued that individuals must sometimes make existential leaps, embracing choices that go beyond rationality and established norms. And in Vietnam, Frank Castle makes a leap of faith into his own moral code, driven by a sense of duty and the necessity to protect his fellow soldiers. It's also alluded to that he sold his soul to the devil here, but his actions, while they are incredibly violent, are rooted in a deep personal sense of responsibility and existential commitment. And Frank Castle's time in Vietnam shapes his understanding of justice after the conflict is over, teaching him that the complexities of real-world violence often require unconventional solutions. And so this existential struggle to create meaning and impose order in a chaotic world becomes the foundation for Castle's later actions as the Punisher, where he really continues to operate according to his own stringent moral code. But this leads us into our next story, which is the greatest Punisher story ever written, and also the darkest and most harrowing story ever written. This was part of Garth Ennis's run on Punisher Max, and it was called The Slavers. And in this story, Frank Castle wages a crusade against a human trafficking ring based out of Eastern Europe. But this story exposes the horrors of modern-day slavery. Now, the Punisher's methods in this storyline are particularly brutal, more than really any other storyline before, and they reflect the severity of the crimes that he seeks to punish. And so in The Slavers, Frank Castle's sense of justice is driven by a profound moral outrage at the atrocities committed by the traffickers, that he sees these individuals as beyond redemption, and his response is swift and merciless. The story underscores the Punisher's belief that certain evils and certain men can only be eradicated through extreme measures by eradicating those men and those evils, which reflects his deep-seated conviction that justice usually requires violence. Now, this reflects Mikhail Foucault's theories on power and discipline, which provide a philosophical lens that allows us to look at the Punisher's actions within this story. And Foucault argued that power is pervasive in society, and that traditional institutions often perpetuate control through disciplinary mechanisms. And so Castle's war on the traffickers can be seen as a rejection of these institutional failures, that by taking justice into his own hands, he's subverting the established power structures and asserting his own form of discipline and control. And so the Punisher's unyielding response to the human traffickers is rooted in this belief that their actions constitute a fundamental violation of human rights, and the severity of their crimes warrants an equally severe response. The best example of this is when he catches the leader of the slave trade ring in the United States. He ties him to a chair, sets a camera up in front of him, hits the record button, douses the guy in gasoline, and sets him on fire while he's alive. Then Frank Castle looks into the camera and says, "Don't come back," and sends the footage to this guy's leaders in Eastern Europe. And it works. They never return to the city of New York. And so this takes us away from Garth Ennis and to Matt Fraction with his Punisher series titled War Journal, which gives us a broader view of the Punisher's ongoing battle against crime. Now, this series explores the Punisher's evolving methods and his impact on both criminals and society at large. And this is reflected in the fact that throughout the series, the Punisher confronts various villains, each representing a different facet of crime and corruption. But Frank Castle's relentless pursuit of justice in War Journal demonstrates his adaptability and commitment to his mission, that he operates with military precision, using his skills and resources to outmaneuver his enemies at every turn. And the series highlights the Punisher's ability to transcend traditional moral boundaries and create his own ethical framework, one that prioritizes the protection of the innocent and the punishment of the guilty. This takes us to Herbert Marcuse's concept of repressive desublimation, which critiques the ways in which society represses individual freedom through institutional norms. And this resonates with the Punisher's actions in War Journal. The Punisher's war on crime can be seen as a response to the repressive forces of societal corruption and criminality. And by rejecting conventional legal and moral constraints, the Punisher asserts his own form of justice, one that seeks to liberate society from the grip of entrenched criminal power. And so in War Journal, Castle's war on crime is portrayed as a continuous and evolving battle, and he adapts his methods to to counter new threats, demonstrating his ability to transcend traditional moral boundaries and create his own ethical framework. And so the Punisher's unwavering commitment to this mission highlights his belief that true justice can only be achieved through relentless and uncompromising action, which of course leads us to the 2017 series by Matthew Rosenberg called The Punisher War Machine. Now in this story, the Punisher acquires James Rhodes' War Machine armor built by Tony Stark, and it significantly expands his capabilities. And this story showcases the Punisher's willingness to use any and all means necessary to achieve his objectives. With the War Machine armor, the Punisher takes his war on crime to a global level, targeting virtually every criminal organization and oppressive regime that he can come across. And the Punisher's acquisition of the War Machine armor highlights his belief in the necessity of extreme measures, that he sees the armor as a tool to deliver justice more effectively, using its advanced weaponry to eliminate threats with surgical precision that he would otherwise be unable to take down. And the story exemplifies the Punisher's commitment to this mission, demonstrating his willingness to escalate his methods in order to achieve his goals. And so this highlights Frantz Fanon's analysis of violence in the struggle for liberation, and it offers this really interesting understanding of Frank Castle's actions in this story. Fanon argued that in the context of colonial oppression, violence became a necessary means of achieving liberation and justice. This was best reflected in how early American colonists and settlers rebelled against the English government and kicked off the American Revolution. And so the Punisher's use of the War Machine armor can be seen as an extension of this principle, and that by leveraging advanced technology, he looks to dismantle oppressive regimes and criminal organizations, viewing his violent actions as a necessary means of achieving a more just world. I say all this to say that in the War Machine comic, the Punisher's escalation of his methods is driven by his belief that greater power is necessary to combat greater threats, and that by acquiring the War Machine armor, he's able to extend his reach and his effectiveness, taking his war on crime to a whole new level. And so this leads us into the final story, Garth Ennis's Punisher Max, because the entirety of this comic book run delves into the entire psyche of Frank Castle, providing a comprehensive exploration of his motives and methods, in the sense that Punisher Max sees Frank Castle as an uncompromising force of nature, dedicated to eradicating crime and corruption everywhere he finds it. And throughout this series, the Punisher confronts a multitude of villains, each representing different aspects of criminality, the slave trade, government corruption, and with stories like Barracuda, just guys who struggle with outright psychosis. But in Punisher Max, Frank Castle's actions are driven by a relentless pursuit of justice, that he operates with a single-minded determination, using his skills and resources to dismantle criminal organizations and protect innocent lives. And this series provides a raw and unfiltered look at how the Punisher does that, showcasing all the lengths that he's willing to go to pull this off. Now this ties us into Karl Marx's critique of capitalism and its role in perpetuating crime and inequality, and it provides a philosophical framework for understanding all the Punisher's actions in Punisher Max, in the sense that Karl Marx argued that the structures of capitalism inherently produce crime and corruption. The Castle's uncompromising stance against crime can be seen as an extension of this critique. By dismantling criminal organizations, he's targeting the systemic injustices that enable their existence in the first place, that his actions are driven by a desire to protect the innocent and promote a more just and equitable society. And so in Punisher Max, Castle's relentless pursuit of justice is portrayed as a necessary response to the pervasive corruption and criminality within all of American society and even humanity as a whole. His actions, while they are incredibly extreme, are driven not by just some arbitrary vendetta due to the death of his family, but by a desire to make the world a legitimately better place. And so wrapping this all back around, throughout his various comic book stories, the Punisher presents a kind of compelling and complex argument for his worldview. He believes in the failure of the justice system and the necessity of taking the law into one's own hands in order to protect people. Stories like Punisher Year One, Welcome Back Frank, and anything from Punisher Max articulate the Punisher's perspective, challenging traditional notions of justice in society society and the social contract that we as a society form and the trust that we put into it. And that by embracing violence and taking on the roles of judge, jury, and executioner, he believes he can protect the innocent and eradicate crime more effectively than the legal system can. And while his methods are undeniably violent and extreme, they underscore his point that the conventional justice system is simply inadequate to deal with the harsh realities of real-world crime and corruption. And so through this lens, the Punisher's actions and beliefs can be seen as a justified response to a world that he perceives as being inherently flawed. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section, and as always, let me know if there's anybody else you want me to cover, and I will catch you all later. Peace.